I ran for maybe 200 yards before my knee gave out a second time, and I went down hard in the creek bed and lay there with my face in 4 inches of cold water and understood that I was done running. The sound behind me had stopped when I fell. I lay in the creek for a moment. Not long, the cold was immediate and serious, and then I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees and got my face out of the water and assessed the situation. Right knee, the bad one, the one that had been scoped twice and would need scoping again if I kept treating it the way I had been treating it for the past 47 years. The fall had twisted it on a submerged rock, and the pain was the specific pain of something structural rather than something muscular, the deep grinding quality that I had learned to distinguish from ordinary hurt a long time ago. I could bear weight on it, barely. I got to my feet and turned around. The creek bottom in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia runs through hardwood hollow that is some of the densest canopy in the eastern United States. May, which is when this happened, puts the bloodroot and trillium up on the forest floor and the leaves on the beeches and maples just past the half-open stage. That particular light green of leaves that have not yet committed to their summer wait. Sound travels in specific ways in that hollow. The creek covers ambient noise from below, and the hollow walls on either side send things back in a way that makes distance harder to judge than you expect. The thing was 40 feet behind me, standing in the creek, not charging, not making any sound, standing in the water with the current breaking around its legs, looking at me. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened in the next several minutes, because careful is the right approach, and I have learned across many years of telling this account, to myself mostly in the small hours when it comes back, that the careful version is the true version, and the dramatic version is a betrayal of what actually occurred. What actually occurred was, I fell, I turned around, there was a Bigfoot standing in the creek 40 feet behind me, and we looked at each other for a period of time I am going to estimate at 3 minutes, but which felt considerably longer. And then it turned and walked up the creek bank and into the hardwood hollow and was gone. That is the whole of the visual encounter. Everything else in this account is what surrounds it, and the surrounding is what changed me. My name is Philip Juice. I am a retired school teacher. 31 years of high school biology in Elkins, West Virginia, which is a small city on the eastern edge of the Monongahela, and which means that I have had the specific experience of teaching the classification of living things to teenagers for 3 decades, while privately knowing that the classification of living things has at least one significant gap in it. I retired 6 years ago. I've been telling this account to myself for 11 years and to other people for 2, which gives you some sense of the timeline involved. The Monongahela in May is turkey season, which is why I was in the hollow. I have been turkey hunting in this country since my late 20s, which is the kind of hunting that requires you to be very still in very specific places for very long periods of time, and which has the side effect of making you a careful observer of the forest at a level of detail that casual walkers do not reach. You spend enough seasons sitting in one spot before dawn waiting for a tom to work his way in, and the forest stops being a general impression and becomes a set of specific relationships. This tree, this understory gap, this drainage, this wind direction, this particular quality of light at this particular time of morning. I knew the hollow I was working that morning very well. I had been hunting it for 11 years at the point this happened. I had set up before first light at the base of a large beech on the north-facing slope above the creek, which is a position I had used before and liked for the sight lines it gave me down to the water. The tom I had been patterning all week had been working the creek bottom in the early morning before moving up to the ridge to gobble, and I wanted to be between those 2 positions when he made the transition. I had my back to the beech, my call on my knee, my shotgun across my lap. Turkey hunting posture, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, waiting. At around 6 in the morning, I heard something moving in the creek bottom below me. Not a turkey. Wrong sound. Turkeys in leaf litter have a specific scratchiness to their movement, a quick, irregular rhythm that any turkey hunter knows after a season or two. What I was hearing was slower and heavier and bipedal, moving upstream through the water rather than through the leaves. I shifted my weight very slightly and looked down the slope toward the creek, and that is when I saw it for the first time. It was moving upstream with its back to me, which is why I had time to process what I was seeing before it processed me. Upright, dark, wide across the shoulders in a way that registered immediately as not human and not bear. I want to address the bear question directly because it is always the first question and it deserves a direct answer. A black bear occasionally moves on two legs for short distances, rearing up to get a better smell or sight line, standing to reach food at height. A bear on two legs in water has a specific quality to its movement. The hip mechanics are wrong for sustained bipedal gait. The weight is carried too far back over the haunches. The stride is short and waddling in a way that is unmistakable once you have seen it. What I was watching move through the creek had none of those characteristics. The stride was long and smooth. The hip mechanics were correct for a habitually upright animal. The arms swung in a low-hanging way that I would later come to understand as characteristic. It was moving through the creek bottom with the fluency of something that had been doing this for a very long time, in this exact terrain, without thinking about it. It was moving with purpose, not foraging, not investigating. It was going somewhere, and the creek was the most efficient route. It went around the bend and out of my sight line. I sat at the base of my beech and did not move for probably 5 minutes. I was running what I had just seen through every available category in my biology background and finding that nothing fit cleanly. Not bear, not elk. We do have elk in isolated pockets of the Monongahela, but the morphology was completely wrong and the creek would be wrong terrain for elk movement at this hour. Not a person. No clothing, wrong proportions, wrong movement signature. I sat there for 5 minutes, and at the end of those 5 minutes I had not found a category. Then I got up and followed it. I left my turkey call on the ground where I had been sitting. I propped my shotgun against the beech. Those two decisions tell you where my head was. I was not thinking about hunting. I was not thinking about protection. I was thinking about closing the distance between myself and something I had not been able to categorize, because closing the distance and getting a better look is what you do when you need more information. And the thing you need information about has just gone around a bend. I have thought about that decision many times. The decision to follow is the decision that led to the running. And the running is the decision that led to the fall, and the fall is the moment that changed everything. But the decision to follow came before any of that, and it was not a frightened decision or a foolish one by my own assessment. It was the decision of a biologist, by training and by inclination, who had just seen something he could not categorize and needed more information. I left my shotgun against the beech, which tells you something about my state of mind. I was not thinking about protection. I was thinking about observation. I followed the creek around the bend and I saw it again, still moving upstream, still with its back to me. Closer now, maybe 60 feet. I followed at that distance for what I estimate was 4 or 5 minutes, watching the movement, the stride, the arm swing, the way it navigated the creek rocks without looking down, the way its weight transferred from foot to foot with a fluency that told me about long familiarity with exactly this kind of terrain. At some point it knew I was there. I do not know exactly when that moment occurred. I did not see a startled response. What I saw was a gradual change in the quality of the movement. A slight slowing, a change in the head angle, a shift in the arm carriage that read as altered attention rather than fear. It knew I was there the way a deer sometimes knows you are there before it shows you it knows, a processing of new information that does not yet require a visible reaction. And then it turned and looked at me. Full turn. Direct eye contact at 60 feet in the May morning light filtering through the half-opened leaves. I saw its face. I am not going to describe it in detail because every description of a Bigfoot face that I have ever read has the quality of describing a mask rather than a face. And what I was looking at was a face with the full complexity and specificity that the word face implies. It was not human. It was also not the face of anything in my biology textbooks. It was something adjacent to both of those things and not reducible to either. It looked at me for what I will say was 10 seconds. Then it turned and walked faster, and I ran after it. That is the decision I cannot fully explain even now. I have a biology teacher's explanation. I needed more data. I acted on instinct. The sight of it moving away triggered a following response that overrode my judgment. I have an honest explanation that I have arrived at more slowly. I was not ready for it to leave. I had been sitting in that hollow for 11 years and I had just seen something that answered questions I did not know I had been carrying. And I was not ready for the answer to walk around the next bend and be gone. I ran for maybe 200 yards before my knee gave out, which brings me back to where I started. I was standing in the creek with 4 inches of cold water around my boots and the bad knee singing its specific tune and the Bigfoot standing 40 feet upstream looking at me. And I understood that I wasn't going anywhere quickly and neither apparently was it. 3 minutes. That is my best estimate of how long we stood in that creek looking at each other. I have gone over it many times and 3 minutes is what I keep arriving at. Long enough that I stopped being afraid. Though afraid is not quite the right word for what I had been feeling. Something more like overstimulated, flooded, the cognitive load of trying to process something your entire framework is telling you cannot exist. Long enough for that to settle, long enough for me to look at it carefully, in the way I had been trained to look at things carefully, and for what I was looking at to become specific and detailed rather than overwhelming. What I observed in those 3 minutes, height, which I estimated at somewhere between 7.5 and 8 feet using the creek bank vegetation as reference. A stand of May-leafed ironwood saplings on the left bank whose canopy I knew to be at about 9 feet, and the thing's head was below that canopy by a foot or so. Build, which was massive across the chest and shoulders in a way that communicated physical capability without the specific threat posture of an aggressive animal. No piloerection. The hair was not raised along the shoulders and spine the way it would be in a threat display. No vocalization, no blading of the body, which is the lateral turn a large animal makes when it wants to present a smaller profile or prepare for lateral movement. The arms hung at rest, wrists loose, hands not fisted. The weight was distributed evenly on both feet. Standing still in moving water requires constant small postural adjustment. I could see those adjustments, the tiny corrections, and they told me the animal was completely comfortable in that substrate. It was standing in the creek in West Virginia in May, looking at a middle-aged biology teacher who had fallen face first into the water while chasing it, and its posture communicated, "This is the best word I have, and I have looked for better ones. Patience." The quality I kept coming back to in the 3 minutes was that it was not afraid of me. Not bravado, not aggression, not the specific calm of an animal that has identified you as below its concern threshold. Something else. Something that read more like the settled attention of something that had encountered humans before and had developed a working framework for what humans do and did not find my presence specifically alarming. It was assessing me. I was assessing it. We were both doing the same thing in the same creek, and the symmetry of that was the thing that slowly replaced the flood of adrenaline with something calmer. It was waiting for me to do something. It was giving me time to do something. It had stopped when I fell, and it had not come closer, and it had not left. And it was standing there with the patience of something that had nowhere more urgent to be, watching to see what I was going to do next. What I wanted to do was take notes. That is the most accurate thing I can tell you about my state of mind at the midpoint of those 3 minutes. The fear had passed and the adrenaline had dropped, and what was left was the observational instinct that 31 years of teaching biology had built into me at a level below conscious decision. And what that instinct wanted was a notebook and a pen and enough time to write down everything I was seeing with the precision it deserved. I had neither the notebook nor the pen. I had my memory, which I have been exercising on this account ever since. What I did next was the only sensible thing available to me, which was nothing. I stood in the creek with my bad knee, and I looked at it, and I did not move, and I did not speak, and I did not raise my hands or make any gesture I could not control. After a while, I could not tell you how long after the 3 minutes ended, time had become difficult. It turned and walked up the left bank and into the hardwood hollow, and the May canopy took it, and it was gone. I stood in the creek for a while longer. Then I walked out. The drive home from the Monongahela is about 40 minutes. I drove it in a state I can only describe as recalibration, the kind of cognitive processing that feels like being very quiet inside while something large rearranges itself. I did not turn the radio on. I did not call anyone. I passed through Elkins without stopping and drove the rest of the way home and sat in my driveway for a while, and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table and stayed there for several hours. I was wet from the creek. I had not changed out of my wet gear. I sat at the kitchen table in my wet turkey hunting clothes in May, and I thought about what I had seen and what the specific quality of those 3 minutes in the creek meant and what I was going to do with it. I thought about it the way I think about things that matter, which is slowly and without trying to reach a conclusion before the thinking is finished. The thinking has been going on for 11 years. I do not consider it finished. My wife Nadine was visiting her sister in Clarksburg that week and would not be home until Thursday. I am glad she was not home that evening. I do not think I would have been able to explain what had happened in a way that did not frighten her. And I was not ready to try. I needed a few days with it first. I needed to let it settle into something I could hold steadily before I put it into words for another person. Nadine has known about this account for 9 years now. I told her 2 years after it happened, which is the timeline of a man who needed 2 years to arrive at a version of the telling that was honest and complete, and that he could deliver without it falling apart in the middle. She listened, which is what Nadine does. She is a better listener than most people I have known in my life, and when I finished, she said, "Are you all right?" I said yes. She said, "Do you want to go back out there?" I said I did not know yet. She said, "Let me know when you know." That is Nadine. That is who she has been for 34 years of marriage, and I have been grateful for it every day of those years, but especially in the weeks after May of the year this happened, when I needed to be around someone who would not require me to explain myself before I was ready, and who trusted that I would get there eventually. She was right to trust that. I got there. It just took 2 years. I did go back, that September turkey season being closed, just to walk the hollow. I had told Nadine I was going for 2 days to do some scouting, which was true enough. I did not find anything I could point to as physical evidence. The creek does not hold impressions the way soft ground does, and the 4 months between the encounter and my return had put a full summer's growth and detritus over whatever sign might have been in the soft ground along the banks. I walked the hollow for 2 days and came home with nothing physical, and a great deal of something else. There is a stand of second-growth beech above the left bank, north-facing, that I had walked past every season for 11 years without giving it much thought beyond its utility as a landmark. In September, I spent an hour in that stand looking at it differently. At the tree structures in it, the way several of the younger beeches had had their branches pushed through the forks of adjacent trees at heights I could not reach standing flat-footed. Not storm damage, not the kind of random blowdown that a strong wind produces. Deliberate placement, the broken ends still showing green at the interior, placed at heights that required either a ladder or something much taller than me. I measured one of the placed branches at 11 feet 6 inches from the ground. I am 6 feet 1. I photographed the structures. I have the photographs. They are not the kind of evidence that would move a peer-reviewed paper forward, but they are the kind of evidence that tells a careful observer something about what had been in that stand and what it had been doing there. What I came home with from September was a different kind of knowledge, which is harder to describe, but which I will try. 11 years of hunting that hollow had given me a working relationship with it. I knew its weather, its light, its animals, the way its particular acoustics worked in different wind conditions. The routes that the turkeys ran in spring and the routes that the deer ran in fall, and the places the creek flooded in March and the places it dried up in August. I was comfortable in that hollow in the specific way of a person who has been paying attention to a place for a long time. What I understood after September was that I had been building that knowledge alongside something else that had been building its own knowledge of the same hollow for considerably longer. Whatever had been moving through that creek on the May morning had been in that drainage before I was born. It knew the hollow the way the hollow knew itself. From inside, from all seasons, from a relationship of duration I could not match with 11 years of careful seasonal attention. That is a specific kind of humbling. Not the humbling of being frightened, which I had experienced in the moment of seeing it for the first time. The humbling of understanding that you are a recent arrival in a place you thought you knew well, and that your knowledge is shallow compared to the knowledge of something that has been there through your parents' lifetimes and your grandparents' lifetimes and probably beyond those. The Setazeles First Nation of British Columbia have documented oral tradition of Saskets going back centuries before any European contact. Their accounts describe a being that is part of the same ecological community as the salmon and the cedar. Not an intrusion into the natural world, but a constituent of it, present in the same landscape across generations too long to count in the way Western record-keeping counts. I had read about that tradition before May, in the vague way you read about things that are interesting but not immediately relevant. After September, I read it differently, not as folklore, as knowledge of a long-term neighbor. I taught biology for 31 years. I taught the classification of living things, the theory of evolution, the principles of ecology, the understanding that every organism exists in relationship with its environment and with other organisms, and that those relationships are the actual structure of the living world. I believed all of that when I taught it, and I believe it now. What the Monongahela Hollow added to that belief was a specific example I had not anticipated. A large, intelligent primate in the eastern hardwood forest whose relationship with that ecosystem is so long and so deep that it had become effectively invisible to the scientific framework I had spent my career teaching. The Sierra Sounds recordings made by Ron Moorhead and Al Berry in the Sierra Nevada in the early 1970s have been submitted to acoustic analysts for half a century and have never been explained. The sustained frequency range, the apparent phonemic complexity, the lung capacity implied by the duration. No analyst has produced an account of those recordings that fits any known animal. I thought about those recordings after September, about what it means that something has been vocalizing in wilderness areas for decades in ways that acoustic science cannot account for, and that the scientific framework has mostly responded to that failure with silence rather than inquiry. I was part of that framework for 31 years. I do not think I failed my students. I taught them what the framework contained, and the framework contains genuine and important truth. What it does not contain, or has not yet formally incorporated, is the animal I stood 40 feet from in a West Virginia creek in May. And the absence of that animal from the taxonomy I taught is not the animal's failure. It is the framework's. The Skookumcast, collected in 2000 in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest by a BFRO expedition, was examined by primate specialists who described it as consistent with a large primate body impression. The cast preserves detail of a forearm, hip, thigh, and heel. The specialists who examined it were not credulous people. They were people trained to assess physical evidence by rigorous professional standards, and they said what the evidence showed them. The paper trail of that assessment exists. What does not exist is a formal scientific follow-up that treats their assessment as the basis for an inquiry rather than an anomaly to be set aside. I retired 6 years ago. The knee needed the scoping it had needed, and I got it done, and I walk without pain now, which is more than I could have said for a long time before. I still hunt the hollow in the Monongahela. Turkey season every May, the same beach on the north-facing slope above the creek, the same sight lines down to the water. I have not seen anything in 11 years of returning to it since the encounter. I have also not gone back to hunting the way I hunted before. What I mean by that is not that I hunt differently in terms of technique or equipment. I mean that I no longer go into that hollow with only turkey hunting in mind. I go in with the hollow in mind. With the whole of what the hollow contains and has contained and will contain, and with the specific awareness that the taxonomy I spent 31 years teaching does not fully account for what is in it. That awareness sits alongside me at the base of the beach the same way the creek runs alongside the slope. Quietly, consistently, as a permanent feature of the landscape. I have told this account to 4 people in full. Nadine, who received it with the grace that is her natural mode. My former colleague at the high school, a chemistry teacher named Berta Chebe, who had his own encounter in the Dolly Sods wilderness, and who understood immediately what I was telling him and why it had taken me 2 years to tell it. A researcher named Vance Holloway, who works the Appalachian Corridor and drove up from Morgantown to sit with me for a day. And now you. Vance said the Monongahela Corridor is one of the more consistently documented areas in the Eastern Record, and that the hollow I had been hunting fell within a range that showed up in multiple accounts across several decades. He said the detail I had described, the sustained eye contact, the patience, the deliberate extension of time before leaving, was consistent with accounts of what researchers in the field called assessment encounters, where the animal has made a determination that the human does not represent a threat and is expressing that determination through behavior rather than flight. He said, it stayed because it decided to stay, not because it could not leave. I had already arrived at that understanding on my own, but it was useful to hear it from someone who had been looking at this evidence for a long time and had context I did not have. The thing had decided to stay. It had stopped when I fell, and it had made a decision about what it was looking at, and the decision was, this is not a threat, and it had given me 3 minutes of open water and May morning light to look at it, which is a gift I did not earn and cannot repay, and have been trying to be worthy of ever since by looking at what I saw as carefully as it deserves. I have not called after anything that went around a bend. The bad knee is the practical reason for that. The other reason is something I sit with every May at the base of that beach in the dark before first light. I followed something into that creek because I was not ready for it to leave. That is the honest reason. I wanted more information, yes, and I was acting on a biologist's instinct, yes, but underneath both of those things was something simpler and harder to admit. I was not ready for it to be gone. I had spent 11 years in that hollow not knowing what else was in it, and I had just seen what else was in it, and the sight of it walking away around a bend was more than I was prepared to let happen without attempting to close the distance. What I came to understand in the 3 minutes we stood looking at each other in the creek is that the hollow did not need me to chase it in order to hold it. The hollow was already holding it, had been holding it for longer than I can accurately estimate. My chasing it was irrelevant to that fact. My stopping, on the other hand, was not irrelevant. My stopping is what gave it the information it needed to make the decision it made, which was to stay. I stopped running and it stayed. That is the part that changed everything I thought I knew, not what it looked like, not the size of it, or the specific quality of its face, or the way it stood in the May current with the patience of something that had no reason to hurry. The fact that when I stopped being a threat, stopped presenting as a chasing, pursuing, aggressive animal, it had no interest in leaving. The fact that it had stopped when I fell, the fact that it had stood in the water and waited for me to get to my feet and turn around, and then given me 3 minutes of open water and morning light to look at it clearly. That is not a prey response. That is not a threat response. That is not the behavior of an animal operating on the instinct systems that govern most of what moves through the Monongahela in May. That is behavior with a social logic in it, a logic that includes a concept of the observer and the observed and some working model of what a human who is no longer chasing represents versus what a human who is chasing represents. I have taught enough biology to know that that level of social cognition exists in a small number of species. Humans, the great apes, certain cetaceans, elephants, animals with large brains, long developmental periods, complex social structures, and extended intergenerational learning. The animal that stood in the creek with me for 3 minutes in May had the social cognition of something in that category. It assessed me. It revised its assessment when my behavior changed, and it acted on the revised assessment. That is what it did. I watched it do it. It extended 3 minutes to me. Deliberately from a position of complete information about my limitations, with the current breaking around its legs and the May light coming through the half-open canopy. 3 minutes in a West Virginia creek is what it extended to me, and I have been trying to be worthy of that extension ever since by looking carefully at what I saw, for as long as it takes to see it clearly. I've not been able to put it back inside the taxonomy I used to teach. I have stopped trying. Some things resist the available categories not because they are mythological or impossible, but because the categories were built without them. And the honest response to that gap is not to force the fit. It is to sit with the thing that does not fit, and let it be as large as it actually is. The hollow in May is as beautiful as anything I have seen in 50 years of being outdoors. The bloodroot and trillium on the forest floor, the beeches and maples in that half-committed spring green, the creek moving over the rocks with the specific sound it makes when the snowmelt is finished and the water has cleared. I go back every year. I sit at my beach in the dark before first light. I listen to the hollow do what hollows do. Whatever moves through that creek bottom before the light comes up is part of the hollow. It was there before me. It will be there after. That is the most important thing I know, and I know it because something stood in the water and waited long enough to let me see it clearly. And I have been looking at what I saw ever since.